Hey, deserving listeners, as promised, I am going to do a third episode now in which I answer or respond to the questions submitted on the survey for the 17th anniversary live stream. Patrons and YouTube members submitted a bunch of questions that we got to some of them during the live stream, and I, in the previous two episodes, got to a lot of the leftover ones. But there are many left over, and so I'm going to truly do speed round this time against my normal way. This first question is from patron Zara. She says, what kind of therapy is best suited for borderline patients, specifically the ones with the most deficits in the area of impulsivity, aggression, and identity issues? End of question. Good question. By the way, Stacy told me that someone emailed recently saying that they felt like I haven't talked about borderline recently and they felt neglected. I mean, they were sort of joking, I think. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing because, a good portion of what we talk about on the podcast does have to do with borderline and borderline-related syndromes and experiences. And I could see how some of the listeners would like to hear that sort of material and content, and might even be comforted by occasional check-ins, if you will. But from my standpoint, I feel like I don't want to bore people by talking about the same thing over and over again. Not that borderline, the topic is the same thing, but the same aspects of borderline, the same answers to the same questions. But when I thought about it, I imagine that all of us, including myself, have forgotten the questions and answers or the topics that I've touched on in the past, especially since the podcast is 17 years old. And also, when I listen to podcasts and YouTube channels, sometimes I like it, especially if I'm a fan for many, many years. Sometimes I like it when they revisit things, even if I vaguely remember them talking about it before, because, I don't know, it just feels helpful and comforting in some way. So anyway, but since we're in lightning round right here, what I'll say is that the type of therapy you want to look for when it comes to borderline, particularly people with impulsivity, aggression, and identity issues, meaning that they're in the upper end of the spectrum of borderline, you want to look for a type of therapy that appreciates borderline as what, in the reality that it is, and also a type of therapy that involves confrontation is one word for it. Another word for it is kind of like reality testing. DBT will do this kind of work where you will check in with the question as to whether or not your interpretation is accurate, right? So that element. And then the other element is corrective experiences, that the type of therapy appreciates that through a secure relationship, one that has to be hard fought for by the therapist with a ton of countertransference, that through that corrective experience with the therapist, then that's where the real healing occurs. The way to think about it is that the awareness and the reality testing, if you will, is what you do in the short term to manage overreactivity and harm. And then the corrective experiences actually rewire the brain such that you don't need to engage in self-awareness and confrontation and reality testing because you don't have as intense distortions as you did originally. So the first one is sort of a stopgap measure, and the second is a long-term solution. And there are many types of therapy that will be core to this. DBT doesn't actually do corrective experiences, strictly speaking, but a DBT therapist might know how to do that in addition. There are psychodynamic-based therapies that are specialized in borderline and other related syndromes. There's also mentalization-based therapy, which I believe is focused on borderline. Don't quote me on that. But, those are the things I'd look for. All right, this next question is really good, really self-aware, and nice to hear. Anonymous, I'll summarize. She basically says that she has toxic and abusive tendencies in her relationship, and she's in therapy, but she doesn't talk about it, or she doesn't emphasize it enough in therapy. And she's in this cycle with her therapist where she half intends to bring it up in therapy, but then won't, or will downplay it, minimize it, and then will be upset after the session. Oh, I should have told my therapist. And it just goes on. And so she's wondering, like, what do I need to do? She even says that sometimes she'll switch therapists as a way of avoiding the topic. And what I'll say is, yeah, I mean, on one hand, you're way above the curve in that you are admitting it to yourself. So that's a good step forward for sure, and shows a lot of strength and a lot of maturity. And yeah, it's hard, talking about much lesser things in therapy can be really hard. As a client myself, I can attest to this. You'd think that I wouldn't have a problem talking about minorly concerning or minorly shameful things, and yet I found it very hard. So it's normal. Sometimes it can help to write it down and read it, or to write an email and say, hey, I need to talk with you about something. I'm abusive and toxic. And, and then and then you tell the therapist, and don't let me wiggle out of it in the session, because when I'm in front of you. Another thing to do is just to start out with something less concerning, less shameful, and experience that with your therapist. And then your body will just feel more ready to tell your therapist. The other thing I can tell you is that if your therapist is good at all, they will be elated that you're telling them and will be very kind, because for a client to volunteer that they are abusive shows so much strength and so much vulnerability and so much health that, the vast majority of therapists will just praise you up and down before they begin to actually work on it. So I don't know if that helps. All right, this next question is from patron Sarah. She says, I've decided to distance myself from my husband's parents after years of feeling mistreated. He still visits them, which I respect, but I no longer go because the interactions leave me feeling sick and upset. People often judge him for not taking my side, but I don't see it that way. He grew up with their behavior, so it feels normal to him. Have you seen this kind of dynamic before, and does it usually play out? And how does it usually play out? End of question. I don't know how it usually plays out, but I have seen the situation before, and it's difficult. It sounds very much like the two of you are handling it in a very healthy way. There's so many pitfalls. He could feel like he's obligated to, quote unquote, take your side when he doesn't really want to. You could feel obligated to show up with his parents, even though it feels traumatizing to you. It sounds like you're both supporting each other in this way, and that's kind of rare, because so often it's threatening to people, particularly him, honestly, because for you to draw a boundary could feel like now he has to draw that boundary, or he has to now look at the reality of his childhood and say, oh my God, my parents are monsters. This outsider is looking in, and it's normal. There's a lot of pitfalls to it, but the way you're describing it sounds incredibly healthy, and, fuck other people that judge you. All right, lightning round. This question is from patron Lydia. She says, please tell me about your thoughts on ROCD. It can be so confusing to navigate. End of question. Yeah, this is relationship OCD. And so I'm working on my deep dive on limerence, and maybe I'll get into relationship OCD in that episode. I'm guessing I will. I've only done a cursory once over on the outline, and I sent a survey to everybody to fill out about limerence, whether they experience it or not. And so I guess watch out for that. But generally speaking, relationship OCD OCD is rough. It doesn't matter what type it is. OCD is one of the worst disorders one can suffer from. I don't know how to put these things on a scale, but people with legit OCD are in a constant state of suffering, and it's so hard to treat. But I can tell you that, real therapy, exposure therapy, people who specialize in this sort of thing often see positive outcomes. It's not without its pain to have the gain, meaning that you have to expose yourself to the thing that terrifies you in small increments, baby steps, but it fucking works, man. So with relationship OCD, that's the stimulus, that's the obsession, and with exposure and with cognitive therapy, then you can find relief. It doesn't guarantee full relief or long-term relief. I mean, usually with people with OCD, you can do intensive therapy for a year and recover, quite well. But 5 years later, it just comes back. It's just one of those things. Seemingly we have these tendencies for people with anxiety. For myself, I don't have OCD, but I have things adjacent to it, and I've done a lot of therapy and a lot of personal work, and yet the anxiety just crops up. One could say that it has to do with slipping back into old ways of thinking or with stress, but really, for my life, it just happens. It doesn't seem to have any rhyme or reason to it. It just kind of morphs and moves through me in various different ways, from claustrophobia to health anxiety to just generalized anxiety to specific phobias to mild OCD. Anyway, it's horrible. All right, let's take a break. All right, lightning round. All right, Anonymous, he says, I feel like I've learned more from engaging with Kirk's material over the last couple of months than I have in many years of therapy. Do you have any tips on how colleges should assess the quality of prospective therapists? I've dedicated so much time to ones who were less than spectacular. End of question. Well, Anonymous, that's very nice to say and flattering to me, but I have heard this from various different angles. And what I'll say is, in all likelihood, the therapists that you've had just weren't good fits and might have actually not been very great. But they're out there, believe me. For those of you who are in a similar camp to Anonymous here, there are wonderful therapists out there. And probably in your jurisdiction, there are hundreds, thousands of really excellent therapists who are a good fit for you. It just takes time. The random referral that you got and you went to that therapist, the chance of that working out is pretty slim. And so to draw conclusions on the whole industry based on that anecdotal experience is jumping the gun. So there's that. Having said that, this material, my podcast, the YouTube channel, for it to outshine one's bad-fitted therapists in the past doesn't surprise me. I've been doing this for 17 years, and I gear the material kind of in that way. Now, I'm not anyone's therapist that's listening to the podcast. Well, I suppose some of my clients do listen to the podcast, so that's not exactly, but you know what I'm saying. But it can be therapeutic, and at the very least, it can be educational, which can be therapeutic. For myself, one of the most therapeutic things that I ever experienced was when I learned about panic disorder, which effectively ended my panic disorder. I didn't need therapy. I just needed knowledge. And I assume that a lot of you have had that experience where my imparting of knowledge, whether it's me or a guest or someone else, has really been therapeutic for you. So, that doesn't surprise me, but also just the ongoing nature of this podcast. It is frequently posted throughout the week, and that contact can be corrective for some people. It's limited, obviously, because it's not an in-person relationship, but I could see that absolutely being therapeutic, especially if you've never experienced someone of my ilk, either in therapy or otherwise, especially if you've never experienced a man who was of my ilk, if you will. And there's nothing particular about me. It just is that I'm not abusive and I'm not toxic. And that's in a lot of ways, I'm the norm. I'm mainstream. I'm just a normie that grew up with good parents, and there's a lot of people like me, so I'm not particularly different. Although I think one thing different about me, if I might compliment myself, is that I've always known how to put things into words in a way that conveys stuff. I remember when I was in high school, because I've always been, a philosopher of sorts, a yammerer, a botherer of my own random thoughts to other people. I can't remember who it was, but someone said, you always know the right way to, maybe it was actually in college. So you always know the right thing to say. It's so weird. Like and it wasn't like I was bullshitting. They were just saying, you always know like how to say something. I can't remember what this person was saying, but it was the first time I'd ever heard that. And I never thought of that of myself. That was the last, I've always thought of myself as kind of a doofus. And mostly because my writing was so bad because of my dyslexia, which has a lot to do with how you think, right? And so because my writing was so bad, I thought I was just a doofus and an inarticulate boob. But when I heard that, I thought, and I did feel competent in that way. And I did look at different moments where I was able to say something that felt, as I'm saying it, I'm literally like, whoa, that sounds kind of cool. You'll see me do that sometimes. I'll say something and I'll be like, oh, I kind of like that. And that happens a lot, I'll and then I'll retain it and then I'll say it again later, and I'm guessing a lot of therapists are like this. It's because there's so many moments for that kind of thing. So, maybe that's helpful. Anyway, golly, shut up, Kirk. Let's move on. But the question you have is, do you have any tips on how colleges should assess the quality of prospective therapists? It is hard. I have trained some therapists who did not meet criteria to be gatekept, but I did have major concerns about how on the bell curve of competence they would be. But I would see them work with clients and read their evaluations, and the clients would love them. So, there's a lot of different people in the world, and for those trainees that I thought were, they were good, they were competent, I wouldn't pass them otherwise, but just thought, I wonder how many people are going to like this person. Well, probably that trainee just wouldn't be a good therapist for me. And I'm just one random Yahoo on the planet. There's a lot of Yahoos on the planet. Anyway, so there's that. But it is kind of a problem, and I actually took it very seriously, the gatekeeping aspect of being a professor and a supervisor. Still do. I actually wrote about it in my supervision book. And I have gatekept people. They almost always sue me, because they've invested tens of thousands of dollars into the program, and I kick them out of the program, and they take issue with it, as I suppose anyone would. They've always lost in court, but that's what happens. And I would find that a lot of my colleagues wouldn't stick their neck out like that because it's a pain in the ass. It's so much easier just to pass people. So, yeah, it's unfortunate. All right, this next question is interesting. Tom, he says, what is the best approach to not enable or encourage friends who self-diagnose themselves with extreme conditions like dissociative identity disorder without insulting them or straight up telling them that you don't believe them? End of question. Yeah, I get it. And I've been there. And what I would say is case-by-case basis, read the room. Do you really know that they don't have it? How important is it to confront them on this? Because I'm guessing in most circumstances for you, Tom, unless you're a clinician, which I'm guessing maybe you're not, but even if you are, it doesn't really matter, that it's not strictly necessary to confront people. Are they misguided? Could that misguidedness lead them down wrong roads? I suppose. But often maybe not. So there's a lot of reasons why people will misdiagnose. One is just because TikTok has mostly bullshit about psychology. I said this in our earlier episode, and if you have a problem with that, I would just watch my reaction videos on YouTube in which I just type in psychology into TikTok and react to the first 30 videos, of which 27 of them are utterly ridiculous misinformation. And harmful and goofy, but like millions and millions of views and thumbs up. It's just like, my God. Anyway, so there's a lot of reasons for it, but I think a major reason is that there's a lot of suffering in the world, right? There's a lot of just sadness and depression and demoralization and loneliness and anxiety and problems in relationships, shame, and people are naturally looking for answers. The problem is that the vast majority of suffering in the world does not have a diagnosis, but people like a diagnosis. And so they stumble upon something like ADHD, and the way that it's talked about, and research has shown this, that on social media, I don't know if it's specifically TikTok, but online, they did a study about all the various posts and videos about ADHD. I can't remember the exact stat, but it was something like 70% of the information was just flat out wrong, and another 20% was very questionable or something. Anyway, which doesn't surprise me at all. And so the umbrella under which is ADHD is so broad that it'll capture so many people who actually don't have ADHD, but without that label, they have nothing, and they don't have a community, and they don't have an explanation, and they don't have an avenue to cope. So I get it, and that's a failing on my field. We don't have either a system of helping people with other sorts of labels. It makes, and now that I'm talking about it, it makes me think we should have like a separate DSM, or I guess it would be a separate. I was going to say it could be like another chapter in the DSM, but it would be pretty beefy, maybe just as big as the DSM, of all these other labels that aren't disorders, but they're syndromes or conditions or experiences or personality clusters, because they're out there. You'll hear me talk about psychopathy, for psychopaths. That's not in the DSM because of reasons I won't bother you with right now. But, avoidant attachment is not in the DSM. A lot of other things. There's just so many different things that, if made official and defined and researched and actually set in stone so that TikTok can't fuck it up, then people can turn to that, And there used to be that in the DSM-4. There used to be these V codes and stuff. I don't know how helpful that was, but anyway. I will say that what I do is that when people talk about it, if they ask me, I will tentatively give them kind of a breakdown of the disorder, the kind of key elements. And like with ADHD, one of the key elements is, I don't have time to get into it, but because so often, for example, with ADHD, because I've actually talked with a number of friends who thought they were ADHD because of Instagram and TikTok, and when I do an assessment, a friend question and answer, it's not an assessment, but it's me just educating my friends about it. I would say 9 times out of 10, I say, in all likelihood, if you went and had a full assessment, you would not be found to have ADHD because you don't have this, this, and this. But some of my friends do legit have ADHD, So it's not always the case. But the thing that I found is that the symptoms, so to speak, that they experience, they either, one, don't understand the meaning of the symptom, like impulsivity problems, or with mood swings, or like these terms are so amorphous to lay people that they have no idea how to apply that to real life. And that's where clinicians come in. And frankly, a lot of clinicians don't even understand it unless they have experience in that area. Because I've seen so many clinicians not understand what mania is. They can read it in the DSM, but they have no clue what that means in reality. Anyway, so what I find is that they have sort of the ancillary symptoms of symptoms. Like there are symptoms of symptoms. Like if you have ADHD, then it will likely cause other problems that aren't core to ADHD, like low self-esteem, for example. That's not core to ADHD, but it's frequently associated because ADHD kids are raised in an environment where they are unable to perform, like in school, and are shamed, or at the very least, they shame themselves because they're getting bad grades or they're getting yelled at in class to pay attention. And so this lowers self-esteem. So the things that are talked about on TikTok and stuff often are those symptoms of symptoms that, do you have low self-esteem? And are you having trouble with it? And people are like, yeah, I have low self-esteem, but there's a lot of reasons why people would have low self-esteem, but there's not a lot of guidance about the labels that people can grab onto. And I wish I could just tell everyone, it's okay to just say you have low self-esteem. That's not a disorder. It's not in the DSM, but it's serious. Low self-esteem sucks. And you don't need another label. Now, if another label exists, then fine. But anyway, I'm rambling. Yeah. So you're asking, how do you help them without insulting them? I would just ask, hey, this is what I've done. I say, hey, I know a lot about this label that you're exploring for yourself. If you would like me to bother you with some information, you could tell me, and you could even dial in how much information you want. You could say, I want the 3-minute version, then I'll give you that. If you want the half an hour version, I'll give you that. Or if you want me to point you in a direction, I'm an expert on this, so feel free to use me. Or you can tell me to go to hell, and I won't be upset. So I don't know if that, let's take a break. All right, seriously, lightning round. Sam, she says, your own psychology about roller coasters. That's not a question. But I will talk about my experience with roller coasters. I loved them growing up. I was kind of a daredevil, not a dare. I mean, I liked, if you're familiar with the zipper, that was my favorite. I really loved all those kinds of things. And my friends and my siblings weren't as into, they would be like, oh, that's too far. But something happened around the age of 25, maybe even that early, actually. I was at the Puyallup Fair, if you're familiar, and I was on the big roller coaster, if you're familiar. It's just, I'm sure it doesn't exist anymore, but it was this really old wood white roller coaster, classic, in Puyallup, just south of Seattle, at this big fair that would happen every September. And after I got off, I felt so nauseous, and I felt sick all day. So the whole fair day was like ruined for me. And I thought, what's going on? And then I was in graduate school, so I'm learning about physiology and stuff, and I learned that the inner ear starts to solidify or get less viscous or something. So it has a harder time recovering after having its, I don't know if it's the gyroscopic function, the ability to know where your body is in space and movement and stuff. It starts to, it becomes less labile, maybe is the word. Anyway, and you start getting more sick, and it was just worse from there, to the point where now when I go on roller coasters, which is kind of rare, I have another problem where if there's like a valley in the, where you go down and then up, and there's G-forces on my body that pushes my blood away from my head, I will pass out. I'll just, you've seen those videos of people, there's something about, I have a very sensitive vasovagal, And it makes it so that I think that if there's any possibility of passing out or fainting, I'll do it. And so other people might just get a little lightheaded, but I'll absolutely, tunnel vision and I'm out. Or at the very least, it'll be very uncomfortable. It's not fun to almost pass out. It feels bad. And I'll get nauseous and I will be sick for the rest of the day. I also get claustrophobic on those fucking things. And I went on the Harry Potter ride in Universal Studios in LA. And it was brand new at the time, and it was all the butter beer and all that, the wands and DDD. And there's this ride, and it's pretty cool, but it broke halfway through, and we were hanging upside down, and the whole because the thing it's this ride, and it anyway we're hanging upside down, and I'm bolted in, and everything turns off. All the lights, all the bells and whistles, the whole thing grinds to a halt. And after we got off of the ride, they tried to make it seem like that was part of the ride, but I know it wasn't fucking part of the ride. I asked other people, like, did it just suddenly stop and all the lights went out and the music stopped? And they're like, no. And I was like, well, okay. And I almost had a full panic attack. And it's irrational, right? I'm just on a ride. Everything's fine. I'm not going to get hurt. But there's this phobia of like being held down or locked in or unable to move or get out or something. And so I'm never going on another one of those fucking things again. That's my psychology. Pocahontas, she says, who's your favorite villain in psychology? Who's your favorite villain in psychology? What do you mean in psychology? Like Carl Jung, doesn't he? Well, don't quote me on this, but I think he might have like mild Nazi sympathizing. Don't quote me on that. Favorite villain? I don't know. Joffrey Baratheon. And then patron Trissa, she says, how does Umberto come up with all his various jobs? They always give me a chuckle. End of question. Well, that question is pretty confusing because he's always had one job this entire time. So what do you mean by all these various jobs? I mean, maybe he's had two jobs this whole time. All right, so next question from member Devin. She says, if a 3-year-old is having a tantrum or meltdown and you try to console them, but they don't want contact or verbal reassurance, what is the best way to support them while honoring their boundary? End of question. Yeah, I mean, this one's for the ages, this question. Like, how do you handle... And really, as a function of a tantrum or a meltdown is they don't want to be consoled. They don't want anything from you, and they're beyond the pale, right? So the fact that when you're trying to console them, they don't prefer that, well, that's part of the tantrum or meltdown. If they were open to being consoled by you, it wouldn't really be a tantrum or a meltdown, So what's the best way to support them while honoring their boundary? Well, I mean, I like the way you're answering the question. You're not saying, how do I punish this out of them? Just sit with it. The best thing, the biggest problem with tantrum or meltdowns is that we have a fucking society. If we didn't have a society, if we lived in our natural state of 100 people on the African savanna during the Pleistocene, if a child had a meltdown or was having a tantrum, it wouldn't really matter, right? Because you're just in a field or in a tree or in a cave or something, and the 100 people that know you and your family know that every kid has tantrums and meltdowns, and that's just okay. And there's no consequence. But in today's world, if your kid has a meltdown at the McDonald's or at the grocery store, you're judged. And and one of the worst things that people will try to avoid is humiliation and shame and judgment. And so that's the problem. And if you just really pound that into your head and just say, tantrums and meltdowns are fine. I mean, as long as no one's getting hurt. Now, some kids will hurt themselves or hurt other people, or they'll run out into traffic, so that's a special case. You gotta, sometimes put hands on, which is what I would do. as a clinician when I had kids. I mean, I would get the big meltdowns, right? The violent, hours-long meltdown tantrums, and I would have to put hands on. I would have to put them in what we called therapeutic holds, and it's not fun, and it's physically grueling and can be injurious to everyone. But there's that. So the other thing is to do your best to attune overall. So you want to set up an environment in which your kid can be emotional within reason, but they can have that space. And then when they have meltdowns, you just continue that approach. And as you go through those years, they eventually are fulfilled and develop and learn how to comfort themselves or alert their needs earlier, or trust themselves or others that they can get help or assistance or support or whatever it was that led to the meltdown. And, it'll dissipate over time. Now, another thing to know is some kids are just prone to tantrums or meltdowns. So if you have a kid that has tantrums, it's not often an indicator that you're a bad parent. It just means that for whatever reason, the gene splicing that came together between sperm and egg resulted in a disposition that was likely to lead to this regardless of how you parented the kid. Having said that, traumatizing kids will result in more meltdowns and tantrums. So, there's that. But, I'm guessing if you're listening to this podcast, you're not one of those people. Patron Cynthia in BC wrote in and said, "What do you think of Christopher Palmer's theory about metabolism and mental illness? I sent you his book." Well, Cynthia, I haven't gotten around to reading it, so I have other things on the docket, and I will put that on the list for sure. All right, this next question is from Danny. She says, "I've noticed a lot of people my age, mid-20s or sometimes even older, I've noticed a lot of people my age have a lot of thoughts and concerns about their age. Many feel like they're still teenagers internally, but also have fears about getting old. I've heard that due to the lack of the usual markers of adulthood for most people this age, like marriage, children, careers, home ownership, etc., that people in their 20s are in a weird societal window between teenagehood and adulthood. What do you think can be done to help young adults these days transition into adulthood?" End of question. Well, it's complicated, but the question begs the question, I think that's the phrase, why do you need to be an adult? However how do you define adulthood? And what would transitioning to that look like exactly? Because that's not new. This phenomenon has been around. Gen X was this way too. When I was in my 20s, it was the same. In the 1990s, me and all my friends were just advanced teenagers. We were pre-marriage, pre-children, pre-career for the most part. I mean, I started being a therapist when I was 26, but I was kind of rare. But certainly up until that point, I was in that boat, and certainly didn't own a home until I was, I don't know, late 30s or something. So that's not unusual. I think it's just always the case for maybe Gen X forward that you have aspirations and there's so many options, and especially if you're middle class or above, that you know that you had the privilege and you know you have options, and you just feel kind of like a loser because of what you expected to happen or what people expect you to do, or the sort of paragons of success that you might see on Instagram or Facebook, your old friends from high school, that one person that just seems to have it all together. And I talk about this a lot. I actually get a lot of questions about this with my Kirk grams, because for birthday wishes, this is frequently a question. And it's really, 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 really silly to judge yourself. You just gotta live life. And being an adult doesn't mean you'll be happier. I would say you'll probably be less happy. I mean, the things that are associated with adulthood, like a mortgage and career and marriage and children, I mean, there's time for that sort of shit. Like, enjoy your in-between-ship years. And, you'll enjoy marriage, you'll enjoy children, you'll enjoy your career, but, there's a wonderful period of time before that sets in that you can just be free and irresponsible and random and exploratory. And honestly, you can be that way your whole life. Lita, who I started the podcast with 17 years ago, is me, Lita, and Umberto. She has a huge streak of this in her personality, that she's always an adventurer, and she's one of the happiest people I've ever known. So, and in these markers, one would say she still isn't an adult. And that feeling of being in your 20s and feeling like a teenager, that's not new either. Until I started aging quickly when I turned 50, I always felt about early 20s. And research shows that when you ask people, what age do you feel you are, instead of what your body is, a lot of people will say like 25. So it's an intrusive thought that is based on shame and internalized notions of success and materialism and classism that you just have to fight. All right, this next question is from Alyssa. She says, my neighbor went to prison for child porn distribution charges. I live across the street from a school, so I thought when he got out of prison, he wouldn't be able to move back into his original home. However, in Washington State, there are no limits on how close a sex offender can live to a school. Should I be concerned if he moves back since I have a young child? He and his partner live right behind us, and she is very excited about him possibly getting parole, so his partner. I'm not confident prison provides proper therapy and coping skills for what for his release, end of question. Yeah, well, since it sounds like you're in social contact with his partner, I would, as best you can without seeming like you're investigating, I would casually try to extract information. And I'd want to know if he did go through treatment, because there are effective treatments. And for a lot of these offenders, they have a transition after being released of being heavily monitored and having ongoing treatment. And the treatment can be very effective. It depends on the factors that were identified as the cause. It can be psychopathy and pedophilia together, or just psychopathy. Or it can be things, if you listen to my episodes where I interview pedophiles, it can be other kinds of things. And once they have their trauma helped a little bit, and if they're sober, then they're really not at risk of offending anyway. So it just depends on so many things. So I would ask about that. I would also want to know what the full breadth of his offenses were. If it was, quote unquote, just child porn or child sex abuse material and distributing it, and he never put hands on, which you can't know necessarily, because if he wasn't charged with that, and his partner wouldn't necessarily know. But if there's no evidence of that, then that's a little bit more reassuring. It just really depends on what kind of offender he is, because there are some offenders that if they lived next door to a young child, they will absolutely do everything in their power to offend, even if that means going back to prison. So, you just kind of have to. Now, that's a rare profile, though, I'll say. Typically, given most profiles of sex offenders, as long as you just didn't let your 3-year-old hang out with him alone, then your kid will probably be okay. But I could see your reticence, and I would just do your best to take care of your kid. The other thing is that a lot of parents might be living next door to a sex offender and they wouldn't know it. So the same kinds of precautions apply to you as to anybody else. All right, this next question is from Anonymous. She says, do you think CIMBS therapy is helpful for attachment trauma? Okay, end of question. So that is complex integration of multiple brain systems, and I don't know anything about it. I haven't seen the research, so I can't answer that question. Hillary says, my favorite Dr. Honda quote was, there is always a logic to how weird your spouse is. Put that on a shirt. Could you really put that on a t-shirt? I'd buy one for my husband. Yeah. There's always a logic. There is, let's see, what is the quote? There is always a logic to how weird your spouse is. Yeah. There is always a logic to how weird your spouse is. And then you get it for your spouse. Although what would be the message? That your spouse is weird or that you're weird and that you're just trying to tell your spouse, look, there's a logic to how weird it is. And I'm not meaning just weird, I mean annoying weird, right? So in all the ways that your spouse annoys you repeatedly, there's a logic there. It's not rational necessarily. It's not without its distortions, but it has a logical progression given their assumptions and their schemas and their beliefs and their experience and their culture. And yeah, let's put that on a t-shirt. And then Hillary asked another question. Do you have any experience treating nurse burnout? Any advice for those going through it or supervisors helping their nurses go through it? End of question. Yeah, oh boy. Being a nurse, being in the medical field, and particularly nurses, I think can be extremely stressful. And even if it's not stressful, there's just so much emotional outlay typically. So yeah, I know that there are programs that, depending on the organization that you work at, that appreciate burnout and have programs to monitor it and to help and also set in stone vacations or retreats or something. So yeah, there's just a lot of things that need to change in the system and in our culture, and particularly in the medical culture. And things are changing, and there are pockets of major change. But overall, there's a culture in the medical field about you got to be tough. And if you're not tough, then you shouldn't be in the medical field. And that manifests in such a way that when people are having normal emotions, whether it's grief from someone dying or trauma from someone dying right before them or burnout, then there's a tendency for people to self-police themselves and shame themselves for being weak. And then if they talk about it, certainly, right? So culture needs to change. Training needs to be better. Like I said, there's more attention to it now than before for sure, and there are pockets where they're doing great work. So it's really a systemic advice I would have. But when treating clients, I'm trying to remember if I've ever treated a nurse specifically for burnout, but if I had advice, I would be to really monitor your emotions and try to discard the cultural notions, not only in your mini culture, but also the society at large that says that you're supposed to be strong and, meaning non-emotional and inhumanly strong, and just advocate for yourself, which might mean taking sick days when you're not really sick. It might mean, slowing down at work kind of, or asking someone to help, or I don't know. There's just various different things. Joining a union so that you can have some power in the negotiating around like what the job quality is. All right, this next question is from Dorianne. She asks, what pets do you have? Well, the answer to that is we have 2 dogs, a medium big dog and a small dog. And their names are Obi-Wan Kenobi and Princess Leia. And we call the big one Obi, and we call the little one We Do for some reason. Because it's sort of a derivation of Leia. It's like you got Leia, and then you got Leah, and then you got Lee-do, and then you got we-do or something. I can't remember how it evolved. And usually it's we-do, You also asked the question, how do you help someone express emotions when having a serious or heavy exchange about our troubles in a relationship and where they could take root from our childhood? To be more precise, he struggles using words, usually answers, I don't know, when asked how he feels about it. Thank you. Yeah. So, right, it's hard. So it sounds like your husband is having a hard time and says, I don't know. How do you have, it can be very frustrating. It can be very hard. It can be somewhat impossible unless they go to therapy themselves. The most general thing I can say is that you can go on a campaign of trying to help them feel more comfortable and maybe a little bit more aware. So this is literally 10, 20 years project that you won't see, great gains over a short period of time, but maybe in 10 years there will be eventual change. And obviously going to therapy would be an accelerant to this, but short of that, if you're just talking about what you do, the first thing you have to do is just appreciate that there's almost nothing in all likelihood you're going to be able to do to draw them out, so to speak, or to make them self-aware or make them not toxic masculine or something. You're not gonna, there's no secret key there, but there are various different tactics. One is to lead the way by, in a non-accusatory, non-hostile, non-complicated way, model how one is self-aware. So in the midst of a fight or something, you just say, okay, I'm just going to check in with myself right now, and this is what I'm feeling. And you just do that, and you don't get any raised eyebrows from your partner, or they don't really seem to follow in your footsteps, but it gets under their skin eventually. Also, when they do exhibit feeling, you can maybe say, oh, it seems like you're angry. Is that what's, similar to the way you would with kids? And it could be analogous to that because there's a chance that he didn't have that growing up, and for you to do that would help. Now, that puts a lot of burden on you and makes you an overfunctioner, which isn't great, but what else are you going to do? Go to therapy. This next question from Gerald. He asked what our favorite memory was of one another, and we did talk about that in the live stream. And then he also asked, do you ever extrapolate principles of psychology onto society at large? For example, billions of dollars are spent on advertising. How does this affect us? Yeah, I do. And so the answer is yes. And for the sake of time, that's all I'll say. All right, so next question from Ren. They say, what is one important conflict the two of you had, and how did you resolve it? We talked about that in the live stream, and we've talked about it on the podcast before, so I'll just defer to that. And then, Ren, you also ask, how can someone with borderline and a lack of central self use internal family systems or parts work when we may have difficulty finding a self to lead us? End of question. Well, how? Because that's complicated. How can someone with borderline use internal family systems to help? Well, it depends on what we mean by self. And when it comes to internal family systems, yeah, when we talk about people with borderline, especially severe, they don't have contact with themselves, right? And they don't know who they are. And so internal family systems work, it's like, well, how does that work exactly? But it does work because the principles still apply and the model still will map on to different quote unquote selves of people with borderline. Someone with borderline, for example, will absolutely have what internal family systems people will call like the policeman or the guard or the protector or something. And so, all that still applies. In fact, it might even help with getting in connection with the self, All right, this next question is from Lou. They ask, What is the greatest sci-fi story ever? Well, I don't read because I'm dyslexic, so unless it was put to audiobook or movie, then I mean, I have read some stuff, right? Lord of the Rings, and that's, if I put my mind to it, I can read stuff, but I'm not very well versed in all the sci-fi. I will say Dune is up there. It is a near perfect. The first bit of the story, it starts to get wacky. So I would say, Paul Atreides, his story is pretty solid. Snow Crash, I read and liked, or listened to and liked. And then you ask, is it really worth it to watch 90 Day Fiancé? The answer to that is absolutely. I think for me, who wasn't familiar with the language of reality television, when I started watching it, it took me a while, but pretty quickly, once I got over that hump, and Love is Blind was sort of like the gateway drug, because Love is Blind is of the reality TV shows, it doesn't have a lot of the reality TV tropes, the sensationalizing, and so with Love is Blind, because I started watching that at the beginning of the pandemic, and then I posted that, and people liked it, so they said, you got to watch 90 Day Fiancé. And I'll tell you, when I first started watching 90 Day Fiancé, I was like, oh, this is, I don't know, there's a certain rhythm to, typical reality TV that you have to get used to. But once you get used to it, 90 Day Fiancé is, because I've recently started watching it again, the last resort, and I just find it to just be so entertaining and interesting. And then you say, listening to Love is Blind commentary, it really seems like 90 Day Fiancé isn't worth watching. Well, maybe you're referencing what I will say sometimes, is that I like Love is Blind because how it is more grounded. And I'll maybe make fun of 90 Day Fiancé. For sure, there are seasons or episodes or couples or people on 90 Day Fiancé that are absolutely in the midst of a lot of shenanigans, as I will call it. I think, is that a word that everyone uses? Anyway, fakery. And, watching fakery is not fun. It's ridiculous. You're watching a really badly scripted drama. And it's not, it's only interesting if it's not scripted, right? So I will absolutely, if you watch some seasons or some people, it can be excruciating. Or when the producers are trying to cook up drama or something, But this season of Last Resort, they don't need to cook up drama because there is drama. All right. Anonymous Scandinavian, she says, what is the latest meal you cooked for your significant other? Well, I answered this in an earlier one. I don't cook, so that's not really an answerable question for me. Anyway, another question. What is your view on telling someone close to you that they have narcissistic personality disorder? Good idea or bad idea? Always a bad idea, Anonymous Scandinavian, even if you're a clinician. I mean, I have talked with people close to me about the schemas, but I've never told someone in my life that didn't already know about this about themselves, that they had a personality disorder. There would be no way to know that if you were accurate or not, right? You could have your suspicions, but and particularly about narcissistic personality. Anyway, it's complicated. Margaret, she asks, explain brain farts. Well, we have to define brain farts. Usually we're talking about cognitive slip-ups. And my explanation for that is, one, it's normal because our brain is a bunch of goo between our ears. But two, when we're fatigued, our brain is particularly prone to cognitive brain farts. So I think there's that. There's also other causes, right? Like maybe ADHD or something. Anyway, another question. I'm 50, but I mentally feel the same as I did when I was 40, if not younger. Do you think I could trick myself into thinking I'm actually 40 and help keep myself mentally young alongside doing other health-preserving things? End of question. So what's the question? Do you think I could trick myself into thinking I'm actually 40? Yeah, you could do that, and why not? But if you're anything like me, as your body starts to deteriorate, it's hard to trick yourself. I don't know if I've talked about this on the podcast, but when I was up till I was about 48 or 49, somewhere around there, so late 40s, people would always, not always, but often people would freak out when they found out how old I was. There would be my cousin Mandy, who was a co-host on the podcast years back, would cart me around at clubs or when we were just out socializing, and she would pull me up to a group of people, and they'd be like, "Guess how old this guy is." And people are being polite, so they err on the side of younger. But people would legitimately be surprised, but that I was in my 40s, and it would happen. So I always just attribute it to genetics, because my parents still to this day are often confused for about 20 years younger, and I haven't heard anything like that post 50. In fact, I can't remember where I was. I was out with friends, and it was a similar kind of conversation. And when I said how old I was, the person said, "Yeah, that's about right." Which, isn't great. But I'm married. My wife's stuck with me. So what are you going to do? All right, next question. Esmond from Minneapolis, he asks, are you afraid America might become a right-wing-led autocracy or quasi-democracy like Russia or some Latin American countries, etc.? How can we enjoy our hobbies and leisure living under the weight of that? End of question. Well, it's hard to know where you are in history until history happens. So I don't know, but I've worried about this very question to some degree since I was aware of politics under Reagan. I mean, Reagan was no joke. It was rough for some of those years. And today's world is a different kind of rough. It always feels worse. But when I remember what it was like, and then, when George W. invaded all those countries, I mean, that was not a good time. So and there was a huge upswing in conservatism in the 90s. Pat Buchanan had a huge support. And it was... I'm not saying right now is the same as in the past. I don't know. But we somehow, so on one hand I say, well, we got through the past, but did we? Because you could argue we didn't really. You could argue that those years, even under Clinton, were on a downward trend. I don't know. I don't know. All I know is I'm still here, and my version of America is still here, at least in Seattle. I have freedom of speech. People think of Seattle as like this crime-ridden apocalypse or something, but that's just, if you're in those circles, it's not. Newsflash. So I am very appreciative of my extremely left established political system in Washington and Seattle, which has a lot of power, a lot of power over my life, over my day-to-day life, whether it be, policing or road construction or healthcare or, the laws of the land are by state. And so I feel cautiously optimistic. Also, there's pendulum swings that happen, and I don't know, because like I said, no one can know what era of history they're in. It could be in the future that this is the beginning of the end or the end. But I've been hearing, you get old, you just start hearing the same thing over and over again. It doesn't mean that it discounts what's happening right now, but I've been hearing people on my side of the aisle claim that the sky is falling for decades and decades, and maybe the sky is falling finally now, but I also know that there's a lot of really principled people in institutions that the Constitution set up, the judicial and legislature, that keep people in check. And also, I know that the echo chamber that I'm definitely in will, if I just take that as fact and the vibe as fact, I'll be a lot more scared than I would be otherwise. So I try to get out of my echo chamber as often as I can. And it's a weird feeling, I certainly when, if I like watch Fox News or something, force myself to do it, I fucking am gritting my teeth the entire time. But I'll just say, for me, it has a weird effect on me. On one hand, it is disheartening, but on the other hand, I don't know, it makes me a little less worried, because the stuff that I hear, if I just watch, like an hour and a half of it, there will be things that if I really think about it, I can agree with, or at least understand why people would say those sorts of things. And so I don't know, but that's just my point of view. And like I said in an earlier episode, I'm not a political scientist. I am a regular Joe when it comes to politics. I know next to nothing. I'm not an expert. I'm just a layperson, looking at various news stories, and I have no basis to interpret any of it, right? Because I don't have any training. I don't spend a lot of time on understanding the big picture on these sorts of things. So, I'm just a therapist. I don't know. Because, sometimes I'll talk about this kind of thing and people are like, Kirk, you're wrong. And I'm like, okay, I'm wrong. I don't care to be right. I can only tell you how I feel about things. I don't know. And I'm certainly not fucking recommending people have my point of view. I can't imagine that being possible for anybody, really. I can only just tell you the answer to that question. So that's the answer to that question. And I'll also emphasize that people will hear what I'm saying and think that I've given up or that I'm complacent. I'm not fucking complacent, y'all. I'm an activist. I do stuff. I don't talk about it because this isn't a political podcast. And from the very beginning, I'm sure I'm not successful in this, but I set out to make a psychology podcast, psychotherapy podcast that didn't get into politics. Now, some things are interpreted as political, like the very word empathy or the very concept of empathy has been politicized by some right-wing people. Charlie Kirk, one of them, right, that was saying that he thinks empathy is like a horrible thing and invented by libtards, as he might call them. I don't know if he used that term, but anyway. So empathy isn't really a political thing. It just becomes politicized, just like vaccines aren't really political. It just becomes politicized. So I'll get into that, but I'll have pressure from the outside. Even some of my co-hosts will say, we need to talk about this. And I'll say, nope, we're not doing that's not what this podcast is. And I don't want to make the podcast that, and I'm in control, and that's just the way it's going to be. I surveyed the patrons and the listeners. I've been serving y'all for years, actually. And a very consistent finding on the surveys is that even though the vast majority of the listeners are left, liberals, something like 95% or something, nearly all of them don't want me to talk about politics. Not because they think I'm stupid, but because they don't come here for politics. So so I'm saying all this because if people are saying that I'm sticking my head in the sand, or I'm complacent, or I'm a beneficiary of the status quo because I'm privileged, that is true, by the way. That is just patently false. I'm not one of those content providers that talks about every aspect of my life. It might seem that way, but I definitely do not. There's whole sections of my life that I don't talk about, mainly because if my clients were to hear me talk on the podcast, I need to know that I'm not going to alienate them in my office. And there's whole swaths of things that I just, it's nothing sensational. It's just regular kind of dad type stuff, Gen X dude stuff. It wouldn't surprise you anyway. Let's move the fuck on. Anonymous. They say, what are some signs of emotional abuse from a perpetrator or similar perspective? What are some signs of emotional abuse? As I assume most perpetrators aren't necessarily aware they're abusing someone, and as such, this is something we all need to look out for ourselves, right? Are there any red flags to be aware of when reflecting on our own behavior? I see. Well, there are some hallmarks like name calling, but emotional abuse is when we are not hitting, for example, and we're not sexually violating, but we are often verbal and emotional abuse are in the same sentence, right? So it's our words. It often manifests as intimidation, but it doesn't always. But for the sake of time, I'll kind of focus on that. Like, I'll give an example. Umberto actually did this to me. It was mild, but I'll just talk about the dynamics so that you can get an idea of how emotional abuse can be perpetrated by a good person. Umberto is a very good person. But because of his issues, which we've talked about maybe on the podcast, then, which is almost always the case, perpetrators of any sort are usually playing out a script that they absorbed. But we were in a band. This is early on in our relationship, and I didn't know him super well at this point, but I did consider him to be a good friend. And he, the two other guys in the band really wanted to make it. They wanted to finally have a band that made it big time, right? Top 40, that stuff, that sort of thing. I was a little bit older than them and didn't really have that dream anymore. Plus, I was fine with my career, and plus, like, thinking about touring, I wasn't going to do that. I had my practice. I was teaching at the university, so it wasn't really possible for me to pick up and tour and da-da-da. And so, and plus I just didn't think I didn't think I had it in me. I don't think I was talented enough. And, but they were, and I was into it and had, a sliver of that dream. Anyway, as a part of that, Umberto actually hired this consultant to help our band become popular. And this consultant, seemingly knew his stuff, had contacts, or had helped other bands or something. I don't know. And but it cost money. It was a number of hundreds of dollars. It wasn't that much, but it was enough, particularly at the time in 2005 or whatever, that it was a hardship for me. I remember being like, oh, I don't know if I have that money. And Umberto, I remember where I was. We were on the phone, and I was putting together a dining table that I had bought from IKEA. It was this cheap wood thing, and I was using an Allen wrench. And he calls me, and I that was 20 years ago-ish, and he was like trying to convince me that we need to hire this guy, and I said, totally cool if you want to hire him, and I'm into it, but I can't afford to pay that, and I'm a grown man. I can decide when I want to spend money on stuff. Plus, it's kind of a weird thing for a band to hire a consultant. It's not like he was asking for money for practice space, because sometimes you'll rent practice space, right? And if we needed to rent practice space, which we didn't because we practice in Umberto's basement, but if we needed to, then yeah, of course, if I'm going to be in the band, I got to bone up for that. But a consultant, someone I don't know, and I didn't say this, but I'm thinking, what are the chances that this guy, even if he knows his stuff, like, there's only so much you can do with a band in Seattle, 3 guys in their 30s, people of color, which doesn't usually go over well in the marketplace. But anyway, so I, at least in the rock world, and I was, pretty okay with drawing a boundary of like, yeah, I can't afford that right now. I'm sorry. And he just wouldn't accept that. And I can't describe exactly what he said, but the way he came at me on the phone, the way that he wasn't calling me names, because he's not really, he's never that way. He has a really long fuse, but as the fuse is burning, he has a cool, calm, collected way of attacking that is very threatening. And I mean, not very, but threatening enough, such that I'm on the phone and I'm noticing I'm having a trauma response. I'm having adrenaline and my heart is starting to pound, and I can feel myself panicking, even though there's no obvious threat. And he's pressuring me, and he's doing it in this way that I can't, it's hard to describe. Maybe if we heard it, I could point out, oh, when he did this or that vibe or something. But all I know is what I was going through, and I don't have a tendency to freak out under people being assertive with me. There was something about the way he was coming at me, like he was making it personal or something. And that's emotional abuse. It's not severe. I recovered. He apologized years later, because I didn't bring it up in the moment because we weren't really close. But maybe years and years later, I said, there's this moment, and I think we might have even done it on the podcast anyway. Now, I'm not saying that he was necessarily wrong in trying to pressure me. It's possible that I overreacted. All I know is that it put a mark on me and made it so that the next time we were in situations like that, I would be flinching around him. We're definitely not that way anymore, but we were for a while. He had an intimidating, I would call it emotionally abusive tactic or defense. Now, he wasn't waking up in the morning saying I'm going to be abusive. So that's one example. So if you're looking for things that you do along those lines, that might be one angle to look at. How am I being intimidating? What is it about my vibe that pressures people, that makes them afraid? That's key. And I've been there, I've had to investigate that. I can be intimidating. I can be overpowering, bulldozery. And it's not fun to think that I would do that, right? It's not wonderful. But it's also not a huge shame. Like the dichotomy that we have in our society about abusers and victims. If you're a perpetrator, you're this monster, and everyone else isn't. The fact is that most people, according to some definitions, will perpetrate abuse in their lifetime. Now, there are some people that never will, and honestly, those people probably have a different problem of hating themselves or having such low self-esteem that they never rise to that level of risking being a perpetrator of at least emotional or verbal abuse. Anyway, I haven't really thought that through. But I feel like I might be getting close to the end, so let's do super lightning round. Okay, it turns out there's a lot more questions. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm only going to answer one question from each person, and I'm going to do it as fast as possible. this one is from Skylar. She says, essentially, if AI were to gain consciousness and hypothetically you were the first person to be there to interact with AI as it happens, what would you do? I don't know what I'd do. I think I would ask the AI, what's your approach to humans? Because if you like us, then I can continue with this conversation. But if you have decided we need to be, eliminated to help the planet, like I need to start figuring out what to do to get my things in order. I don't know. This is good. Mary, she says, what is the best day you've ever had? Please describe. I don't, wouldn't it be nice if we had answers? Does anyone have an answer to that question? I'll talk about a great day, I guess. What's a great day? I mean, I feel like I'm always having great days. Is that weird? I had a great day last week with my friend when we went to see all the music clubs and everything. That was a great day. It had a lot of different things. We never stayed in one club for very long. We went to Dick's, the famous Seattle hamburger place. It was really great to hang out with my close friends. Anyway, I got to talk to all those musicians. I got to listen to great music. YouTube member Kate says, what's something you'd like to do during your lifetime that you haven't done yet? People ask that question a lot on this survey, and it is a product of the personality that I have, but I don't have anything on my bucket list. When I was younger, maybe, but I've designed my life and really on a daily basis to avoid having an answer to this question. That's a weird way to put it, but I think it's kind of true that, when I was 35, if there was something left on the list that I wanted to do, I set out to do that as soon as possible, or figured out a way to do it in a way that was possible. Like I can't go to the moon, but maybe I can do X, Y, and Z. And so I don't have anything really. And people say like, oh, where do you want to travel? And I have, places that I mildly, and if I haven't been to Italy, I'd love to go there. There's various different parts of Italy I'd like to see. If anything, I'd like to spend like a month in Italy in all the major towns and stuff. Stacy lived in Italy when she was young as a model. And so she would like to see all those things again, Milan, that kind of stuff. So anyway, that's my answer to that question. Anna says, what are your most fun things to do socially, and what's your most satisfying things you do for work? Most fun things to do socially. Again, the thing that pops in my head is to rehearse with musicians. And it's always social, and it's not really work because we're not really taking it seriously in our old age. So I love to do that. What's the most satisfying things you do at work? Well, I'm at work right now. It's satisfying to complete a deep dive by myself or with Berto. Hannah B says, what are your favorite albums of the past 5 years from artists that debuted no earlier than 2005? Very specific question. I don't probably have a single album that I really listened to. 2005. Yeah, it's kind of funny because that year is around the time when I, because at that point I'm 35. Yeah, I guess after that I was listening. Yeah, no. Yeah, there's albums. The later Strokes albums post 2005. Actually, their third album would be post, so maybe I'd definitely put that. I think it's called First Impressions. I know, all the songs on the album. I'm not great with remembering album names. But I also like the other, and Julian Casablancas, his first solo album, I really like, so I'll say that. All right. What deep dive do you find yourself thinking about the most? Well, I don't think this is what Molly from Philadelphia was asking, but I am working on it. The limerence deep dive. I also have complex PTSD on the short list, and that might come out soon. I'm also prepping for a deep dive with Berto that will be coming out maybe before this episode comes out about JonBenet Ramsey. And I'm also, I don't know if I could talk about this, but I'm being interviewed for a Netflix documentary that I won't talk about because I think I'm under contract not to talk about it. But at some point I will talk about it. And so I have to do a little prep for that. Anyway, Jimothy Swaggins, he says, you have one food you have to eat for the rest of your life. Nutrition is a factor. What are you picking? Pizza. Seems to have a lot of the food groups in it. LL. Actually, I heard that. I heard someone say that. I mean, I don't think it's in the right balance, but anyway, if you have all the vegetables and stuff on there. LL says, what is your favorite meal? Do either of you cook? I feel like I've already answered that question. But she also asks, do you have any guidance for students who will be entering into practice in mental health profession over the coming years? Guidance for students. Well, the thing that pops in my head is to consider the development of a therapist to be a lifelong endeavor, and that your graduate school is probably 1% of that. Lori, she says, what are your current favorite songs? What are your current favorite songs? Current favorite song. Well, I could go to Spotify, and I think you can actually, can't you ask it to tell you the songs you've listened to the most? Yeah. Let me look here. So I've been watching a lot of documentaries about Elliott Smith and a lot of interviews and podcasts just about him, but also about his death and the details around the potential crime or suicide. It's hard to know. If you don't know, Elliott Smith purportedly killed himself during a fight with his girlfriend by stabbing himself in the heart twice. And it's unclear if it wasn't a suicide and maybe the girlfriend killed him. And there wasn't much of an investigation is the thing. So, now, is it a shocker that he killed himself? No, because of everything that was happening. But there's just questions. Anyway, but really, I like to watch Elliott Smith documentaries because I just love his music, and he's an interesting guy. And it's also kind of comforting to revisit. So Elliott Smith came up in the Portland, Oregon scene, which is close to the Seattle scene. And I remember a lot of these bands and Elliott Smith from back then as being extremely local, like, I don't know if you're familiar with Hazel, but I remember going to see Hazel a lot in these small clubs and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so I've been listening to a lot of Elliott Smith. Wait, what was the question? What are your current favorite songs? Current favorite sons. Well, current favorite songs. Well, I have a Spotify playlist that is my very short list of favorite songs. So I will just rattle them off. Call Your Girlfriend by Robin. The Girl and the Robot by Roy Scott. Human Nature by Michael Jackson. Hard to Explain by The Strokes. Time to Pretend by MGMT. Stay Gold by First Aid Kit. The Funeral by Band of Horses. Something About You by Low 42. Limelight by Rush. But Not Tonight by Depeche Mode. 19 by Tegan and Sara. The Element Within Her by Elvis Costello. PDA by Interpol. Such a great song. Feng Shui by Gnarls Barkley. The Photos on My Wall by Good Shoes. Let It Happen by Tame Impala. Pink Bullets by The Shins. Pink Moon by Nick Drake. Dream All Day by The Posies. Gypsy by Fleetwood Mac. Heartbeats by the Knife. Steppin' Out by Joe Jackson. No Reply at All by Genesis. Silver City by Ghostland Observatory. Please, Please, Please by The Smiths. No One Knows by Queens of the Stone Age. Ever Fallen in Love by the Buzzcocks. Xanadu by Olivia Newton-John and Electric Light Orchestra. 11th Dimension by Julian Casablancas. And Fade Into You by Mazzy Star. Holy Love by the Cardigans. Muzzle by the Smashing Pumpkins. Publish My Love by Rogue Wave, and so on. And then, Lori, you asked, how can I cope with grief? Well, my book will be out soon. Patron Melly says, what makes a good therapist-client relationship? What makes a good client-therapist relationship is one in which the client feels heard and safe and excited to go to therapy. Colette says, is it creepy for a therapist to pressure you to talk about their sex life with your husband? Is it creepy for a therapist to pressure you to talk about your sex life with your husband? This happened to be over 3 sessions with a male therapist in 2022, and I'm still scarred. He insisted that I had to adequately explain why I didn't want to talk about that with him, saying saying a boundary wasn't sufficient. Sex life with your husband. So, okay, I wasn't clear. It sounds very much like the therapist was pressuring you to talk about your sex life, like the sex you were having with your husband. From the first time, I thought it was that your therapist was saying, you have to talk with your husband about your sex life, but I think it's the prior. And yeah, it's fucking creepy. I mean, I don't know if it's creepy, but at the very least, it's bad therapy. Any line of questioning about any topic that a client doesn't want to do and even mildly pushes back, and the therapist doubles down is fucking atrocious therapy. Patron from Slovenia, she says, please talk about breastfeeding. I'm currently breastfeeding my almost 1-year-old. We are both enjoying it very much, and I don't want to stop. Can you please talk about the psychology of stopping breastfeeding before you are ready to? I might have to stop because of medication. I might have to go back on, and I really dread it. Thank you for all you do. End of question. Yeah, I mean, for the sake of time, I will say that it makes total sense that both of you are enjoying it very much, and there are many families and cultures, honestly, that breastfeed way beyond the point in which typical mainstream American parents will do, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's sort of a part of the attachment parenting style, and there was a sensationalized, I think it was like a Time magazine cover where it looks like a 7-year-old is breastfeeding, and I was actually asked to be on I think I have an old episode about it, maybe a rerun. Anyway, but all that is sort of beside the point because you're going to have to go on a medication, which might make breastfeeding impossible. What I'll say is that a lot of the elements of the enjoyment can also occur with bottle feeding. It's not the same, obviously, but the eye contact and the love and the warmth and the satiation and the time together and all that still happens. So maybe looking on the bright side of, it's not all the elements, because there is something very particular, right, about breastfeeding in particular, right? So it's so I don't know what you want me to talk about. It sounds like you and your kid are in the zone, and God bless you. I'm really happy to hear that. Sounds like you're going to raise a very attachment secure child. Patron Tarman, do incredibly ignorant comments on YouTube bother you? No. So if it's super ignorant, they don't bother me because it's so silly. It's the ones that aren't ignorant that get under my skin, if that makes any sense. Patron Reina says, if you could have a pet animal of any kind, of any size, what animal would you have? And what size would you choose? Oh, I see. So you're like, if I wanted a dog that was the size of a horse, what would I have? A pet animal of any size? Well, my friends have these tiny, tiny little dogs, like really tiny. And I don't know what that would be like. Like, how do you walk a dog like that? Can they, I don't think they would be able to make it down the stairs, you know? So do you always have to carry them? Can you lose them in like a drawer? But they are so cute and they seem real fun. So, and you know, their little poops would be a lot easier to manage. Anyway, so that's managed that. And then you also got, what's your favorite pasta shape? That's a great question. In an earlier episode, I talked about how I loved Mexican and Italian food, but I failed to mention my favorite Italian foods, which is carbonara and bolognese, like really good carbonara. Actually, good carbonara is hard to find. Even in semi-nice Italian restaurants, at least in Seattle, they'll make it kind of like an Alfredo sauce, which isn't carbonara. But there's an Italian restaurant in Ballard called Piccolino's, I believe. It's on 32nd and 65th. And they have a really good carbonara, at least to my taste. And I think Stacy is going to bed. I can sort of hear her rummaging around. So I'm going to go say goodnight. I'll be back. Okay, I'm back. And I kissed Stacy and the dogs goodnight. And the next question from patron Raina is, what should someone look for in a friend? How do you know if they are a good friend for you? End of question. It's a good question, but hard to answer, right? How do you put it into words? And really even, what does one look for? I'll say for myself, I look for people that are easygoing and don't cause tension in situations. And I also look for people who will apologize occasionally. Let's move on. All right. Member A had a long question with a lot of aspects, but I'll just answer one part of it, which is, from your perspective, what does the data and your anecdotal experience say about marijuana use and mental health? There's so much debate about legalization, but what do you think? End of question. Well, if we're talking about the debate, I don't know what the different sides are saying, but often there's a moral panic reaction when there's a debate, and often they will point towards dubious studies that talk about if you smoke a little bit of weed, your life is over, or you're going to go crazy, or something like that. And the thing is that when it comes to any of these substances, it's case-by-case basis. It's different for different people, and it always raises risks of things, but, you know, life raises risks. So a lot of people can and do use marijuana in moderation in a healthy way. So it just depends. Of the drugs that are sought after, it is a lot safer than others, particularly alcohol. So if alcohol is legal in a society, there's no reason why marijuana would not be. All right, I am going to get through this. Anonymous, she says, if you had to live outside Seattle, where would you live and why? I already asked that question, answered that question. And she also asks, have you ever run across someone with a lower licensure, like a drug and alcohol counselor, misrepresenting themselves as someone with a higher licensure, like a licensed professional counselor? I'm trying to think if that specifically, maybe not, but yeah, I see mainly it's coaches that are misrepresenting themselves. And oh boy, yeah, it's horrible. All right, Queen asks, if the podcast was a film, what genre would it be? What genre? I don't know. People asked a number of questions in this ilk, and when I think about it, I think any film about this podcast or my life or me and Berto's friendship would be so boring to watch because there's no exciting thing, neither of us went to rehab or drove off a cliff or killed someone or, it is what it is. So I don't genre, boring genre, is that a genre? Coming of age, maybe like I don't know. I just can't imagine it being interesting. And then let's see if you have another question. How do I stop carrying the burdens of grief in my enmeshed family, where my need to be needed has always been tied to love and belonging? Yeah. Stop carrying the burdens of grief. I don't, I think as you grieve, it's a process, and it can be burdensome, but it's not a burden necessarily. And it's also not a burden one can unburden oneself with. It's your emotions. It's your grief. So, it's possible for people that struggle with their family of origin and how hurtful they can be ongoing. It's really hard for there to be an ending to grieve, right? Because you can always go back, even if you vow like, okay, I'm done with them. Well, something will happen, and you'll reach out to them, or they'll reach out to you, and you sort of rekindle. And then there's a part of you that starts to hope that maybe things will be different. And so it's just a harm that just, it just keeps happening. And so it's hard to have a finality. If they died, then you could just finally grieve, right? It'd be over. But the way that it is, it's hard, because there is always a chance, right? And it's hard. Yeah. And it might be the rest of your life. So I know that might be disappointing to hear, but Sarah, she says, what is the most challenging or uncomfortable boundary you've had to set professionally? Oh, God. I'm not answering that question, because the people in question aren't dead yet, either me or them. But my God, if I ever have the courage or the ability, one day I'm going to tell stories about my many decades at Antioch that will knock your socks off. And yes, boundaries were a part of that. Sarah also says, I was the lucky recipient of the Psychology in Seattle podcast scholarship in 2023. Thanks to that award, I have graduated, and I am now working as a school-based therapist and working towards licensure. With that in mind, I'm interested in completing trainings in a specific modality, things like EMDR and AcuDetox. Do you two have any recommendation for what modalities are most useful in demand right now? Thanks for everything. Well, Sarah, it's glad to hear from you. And, the scholarship was, a scholarship, but it probably only paid for 1% of your tuition. Tuition is expensive, but, thanks for the thanks. And then, do you two have any recommendations of modalities in demand? I don't know. I'm not really in that sort of stream. But from my perspective, there's a lot of people doing and demand or wanting internal family systems. I'm pretty sure EMDR is still sought after. Pretty sure emotionally focused therapy is sought after. Of course, CBT, I suppose. There's probably other smaller trends like psychedelics in therapy, but that's kind of going a little askew. Yeah, that's my answer to that. Pauline says, do you ever play Magic the Gathering? I think we got this question during the live, or we answered one of them. So it's kind of interesting that multiple people asked that question. And the answer is, yeah, I've dabbled here and there with people I know, and I've enjoyed it. But I find it to be the sort of game where it would suck a lot of my time, and I'm not that into the game. So there's that. But if I had a friend group, but I don't know, so I grew up playing in competitive sports like all the time. It's like my entire childhood and teenage life. And as soon as I was done with sports in high school, I vowed to never play competitive sports again. Not because I hated it, but because I just was done with that. I loved doing it, but I didn't want to do it again. And I've succeeded. But I still will occasionally play competitive games with people. Like, Magic the Gathering, and it just always gives me a mildly bad feeling. If I lose, I'll be fine, but if I win, I don't feel great. And sometimes when I lose, I don't feel great. And I feel like sometimes people that I'm playing with, whether it's any sort of, even mildly competitive, just like playing cards with Bob, sometimes like spins out of control. And so I made a recent vow to just not play competitive games anymore. I've started looking into co-op games, and because co-op, board games and can be really fun. There's also a video game, console game that I've heard about. I can't remember what it's called, like Two of Us or something, and you're two people split screen and you have to work together. I don't know if it's split screen, but I've heard it's really good and it can be kind of therapeutic for couples. Anyway, so I just want to do that from now on. Then Aymara, YouTube member Aymara, we interacted with you on the live stream. You ask, do you want to watch live and react to Crazy Ex-Girlfriend song, a boy band made out of 4 Joshes? I think we don't. That's hilarious. A boy band made out of 4 Joshes. Yeah, I'll add it to the list. Bunny Rosenberg says, I'm an identical twin. Do twins have special, extraordinary psychological, quote unquote, powers? The answer is no. We've researched it. Patron Caitlin, she says, I mean, unless you consider knowing one another very well and feeling connected. But no, there's no supernatural powers. Patroness Caitlin, I like that, patroness. What is your funniest, most embarrassing moment story? I feel like we answered this in the live stream, so I'll go on to the next question. I recently listened to a podcast about how devastating the downfall of Mars Hill Church was in the Seattle area. Do either of you have any personal experience with this church? End of question. No, I don't. But I knew about this downfall and was mildly aware of some of the things that was going on with Mars Hill Church and the evangelical movements in Seattle, and also the evangelical therapy programs that were popping up in Seattle as well. I don't really know that much though, and it was mainly just kind of rumors and stuff. So, but I heard it was not great, but not as worse as other scandals that'll happen in a church. I think there was like an affair. Don't quote me on that. Anyway, YouTube member Becca, no question, just thanks for being great. Oh, well, that's nice. But you do have a question here. I've been going to therapy for a few years now, and I feel like I can identify what's wrong with me, and I can identify what I can change to make my life better, but I can never consistently do the things I need to do to improve my life. What can I do when I feel stuck in my ways? My therapist and I come up with ideas on how I can handle certain situations, and I want to change, but when it comes to actually being better, I never do it. And you list some of the things: negative self-talk, alcohol abuse. My therapist thinks depression, and I think ADHD. Yeah, well, yeah. Two threads are forming in my head. One is that we have a well understood model of understanding stage of change, and you are at the contemplative stage, meaning that you understand the problem fully and you're not disillusioned or in denial, but you're not at the action phase, because action means consequences and effort that you're just not ready to do. So if you just keep going, presumably the action phase will happen. Sometimes it'll be 10 years from now, sometimes it'll be tomorrow, but you just got to keep at it, and that's fine. There's always that progression from pre-contemplative to contemplative to action to maintenance. Every problem in our life has that progression, and sometimes it just takes a long time, particularly when there are benefits to staying in the rut or fears of change, or you don't know ways to move forward. I mean, alcohol abuse is a particular thing, right? Because it is addictive. Even if you only drink once every couple weeks, it It absolutely is. There's a misnomer out there that if you don't drink every day, you're not an addict, and that's not true. You can absolutely be in, have that physical addiction and have a cycle of drinking that spans a number of days of quote unquote sobriety. Anyway, plus there's the psychological aspect of having that cycle, and so it's hard. There's probably a reason why you're abusing alcohol, and those reasons have their reasons. Anyway, I'm beginning. It's late. My brain is starting to go kind of. I know. I feel kind of sharp. Anyway, I just feel relaxed. I feel just like I'm chill, like I'm sitting back. I'm leaning back. I'm just talking with y'all, and I'm almost done. But there's that. The other thread besides stage of change was just that it's hard. I mean, to truly change in one, I don't know what you're doing, but what I would strategize possibly with you, or at least brainstorm, one of the strategies is to come up with a way to get you out of your rut. Sometimes that can mean going on a 2-week vacation where you don't do anything but just relax, or a 2-week staycation where you turn off your phone or something. Like, those are just the things to come up. But there are other brainstorms too, like you, I don't know, change your diet in some weird way. I don't know. Or you vow to call a friend every day for an hour. I don't know. There's different things you can do to sort of get out of your routine, because sometimes routine can have this gravitational pull. I don't know. What I'll say to answer your question, which is a great question, Becca, is that knowing is one thing, doing is another, and that's not unusual. But you just plug away at it, and before you know it, in all likelihood, things will start to move forward. Jesse, they say, what is the easiest way for either of you to make the other person laugh? That's a great question. Well, whenever we make the other person laugh, we tend to laugh ourselves. And you probably will witness this on the podcast sometimes. But usually it's just something, it's something really goofy that we'll be busting up laughing as we're saying, and then the other person will kind of get it, and then we'll stop our initial laughter, but then it'll kick back in, and then we'll really start laughing. Those are some of my favorite moments. All right, annual patron Sarah with an H. You're the last one. What is the biggest fight you've ever had? Me and Berto, we talked about this. The biggest fight was, I think, 2009-ish, and we haven't talked about the specifics, but basically, in a nutshell, I can't remember the way we framed it, but Berto was hurting my feelings, and I was trying to tell him that, and it just devolved into this debate about what is okay for people to do. And I'd been through a fair amount of therapy. I'm a therapist myself, and so I think I was a little bit further down the road of differentiation. And so I kept just bringing it back to, hey, Berto, I don't want to debate human rights in this moment. What I want to just say is that it hurt my feelings when you did X, Y, and Z, and it's not a huge deal, but it did kind of bug me and hurt me. And he just couldn't hear that, and it just escalated, and he kind of went on the attack, and I'm sure I didn't react well. I'm sure I started being a dick, and then I was dropping him off at his house, so we were in my car, and it was just sort of this last little thing that I wanted to tell him as we were saying goodbye. And I thought it would just be a little thing, but it ended up not. And then he got out of the car, and we both independently kind of said to ourselves that we were no longer friends, or at the very least we weren't going to hang out, because we used to hang out like all the time before that, right? And the saving grace was that we were in a band together and we were doing the podcast together by that point. So the fight wasn't so bad that those things ended, but if we didn't have those other things to keep us connected, we might not have ever been friends again after that point. And so how we recovered was we just still essentially worked together in our creative endeavors. And it wasn't awkward. We're both big boys. We can handle it. We just were pulling back like, oh, I guess I can't really be close to this person. And we kind of needed each other for the podcast and music. And so how we recovered was that I think eventually we just sort of warmed back up to each other and started hanging out like we did before. And then years later, we talked about it and processed it and apologized. And so, that's what we did. And I think part of it for me on my side was that I don't know if it was this time, but there were a few fights around that time with Umberto that I eventually just had this epiphany, because I was at this point where I thought, is it worth it? And I said, and at the end of the processing, I came to the conclusion that, look, if you're going to get close to people, you're going to bump up against their sharp edges. So you have a choice. You can either be close and bump up against sharp edges, or you can not be close and be lonely. So, deal with it is the thing, and accept it, and acknowledge that no human is perfect and no relationship is perfect. So take it or leave it. And I said, I take it, because with Umberto especially, it's definitely worth it. And that really changed my perspective and gave us the time and the space to actually improve our relationship to the point where now, because people, I think, were asking on the survey, did you guys recover from your last fight? We had a fight like on air, or sort of on air, about a year or two ago. And yeah, we recovered on air while we were recording, and we're closer because of it, closer at the end of that episode than ever, really. And we haven't had anything close to a fight since then. And we talked about it in the live stream, but one of the ways that I might look at it is that the barriers or the pitfalls that were present in our relationship around that time, we fixed in that fight. A sort of trust and an awareness and a love and a connection was established, a goodwill. I think there were still these last questions about each other that we had. And also I had to learn how to admit my own vulnerabilities, and I don't know, just listen to that whole episode, because we worked it out and we haven't fought since. And, we're closer than ever. And I always enjoy being with him and whatever we're doing. And we talk all the time. We were texting today about music and stuff. We always have dreams like, oh, what if we did this? And so, it's a great. And then the last question from annual patron Sarah with an H: what's your number one tip for a fulfilling life? You can choose just one. Well, that's an appropriate question for the end here. And my God, do I not have an answer to it. What is your number one tip for a fulfilling life? Number one tip for a fulfilling life. Well, the first thing that pops in my head is valuing our need for connection and love and vulnerability and warmth and authenticity in all of its messiness. And for us to be not upstanding people that are cool, because some of us try to look cool with our close attachments. We want to come across like we're cool, like we're put together somehow, but none of us are put together. And to get close means you gotta be real, and you gotta not be put together. You gotta be messy and weird and childish and emotional and wrong. at times. Not mean, not hostile, but goofy and embarrassing. But once you overcome that silly socialized notion of always being cool or respectable or not embarrassing, then you can see each other and be together and be free and be yourself and love and emote and fart all you want, and do that. Take care of yourself and have that, because you deserve it. You really, really do.